Hi, and welcome to the last video, Creating Cluster on Azure. So let's start with some of the basics. First, we will have a look at cluster security. Certificates are used in Service Fabric to provide authentication and encryption to secure various aspects of a cluster and its applications. Moving on to Cluster and Server Certificate. This certificate is required to secure a cluster and prevent unauthorized access to it. It provides cluster security in a couple of ways. Cluster Authentication authenticates node-to-node communication for cluster federation. Only nodes that can prove their identity with this certificate can join the cluster. Server Authentication authenticates the cluster management endpoints to a management client, so that the management client knows it is talking to the real cluster. To serve these purposes, the certificate must meet the requirements as seen here. Firstly, the certificate must contain a private key. The certificate must be created for key exchange exportable to Personal Information Exchange .pfx file. The certificate's subject name must match the domain used to access the Service Fabric cluster. This is required to provide SSL for the cluster's HTTPS management endpoints and Service Fabric Explorer. Let's take a look at the client authentication certificates. Additional client certificates authenticate administrators for cluster management tasks. Service Fabric has two access levels, admin and read-only user. At minimum, a single certificate for administrative access should be used. For additional user-level access, a separate certificate must be provided. Azure Active Directory is the recommended way to authenticate clients for cluster management operations. To use Azure Active Directory, you must create a cluster using Azure Resource Manager. Next, we see the application certificates. Before creating your cluster, consider the application security scenarios that require a certificate to be installed on the nodes, such as encryption and decryption of application configuration values, encryption of data across nodes during replication. Application certificates cannot be configured when you're creating a cluster through the Azure portal. To configure application certificates at cluster setup time, you must create a cluster using Azure Resource Manager. You can also add application certificates to the cluster after it has been created. So now, let's create cluster in the Azure portal. Creating a production cluster to meet your application needs involves some planning to help you with that. It is strongly recommended that you read and understand Service Fabric Cluster Planning Considerations document. First, sign into the Azure portal. Then, click Create a Resource to add a new resource template. Search for the Service Fabric Cluster template in the Marketplace. Navigate to the Service Fabric Cluster blade and click Create. The Create Service Fabric Cluster blade has 4 steps. First one is the basics. In the Basics blade, you need to provide the basic details for your cluster, say DevOps cluster. After that, enter a username and password for remote desktop for the VMs. Make sure to select the subscription that you want your cluster to be deployed to. I'll use an existing resource group, DevOps. Although you can decide to use an existing resource group, it is a good practice to create a new resource group. This makes it easy to delete clusters and all the resources it uses. Select the region in which you want to create the cluster. You must use the same region that your key vault is in. Next, configure your cluster nodes. Node types define the VM sizes, the number of VMs, and their properties. Your cluster can have more than one node type, but the primary node type must have at least 5 VMs, as this is the node type where Service Fabric system services are placed. Do not configure placement properties, because a default placement property of node type name is added automatically. Choose a name for your node type. The minimum size of VMs for the primary node type is driven by the durability tier you choose for the cluster. The default for the durability tier is Bronze. Select the VM size. D-Series VMs have SSD drives and are highly recommended for stateful applications. Choose the number of VMs for the node type. You can scale up or down the number of VMs in a node type later on, but on the primary node type, the minimum is 5 for production workloads. Other node types have a minimum of 1 VM. The minimum number of VMs for the primary node type drives the reliability of your cluster. Single node cluster and 3-node clusters. These are meant for test use only. They are not supported for any running production workloads. Configure custom endpoints. This field allows you to enter a comma-separated list of ports that you want to expose through the Azure Load Balancer to the public internet for your applications. For example, if you plan to deploy a web application to your cluster, enter 80 here to allow traffic on port 80 into your cluster. I'll enter 80 and 8081 as custom endpoints. Now, configure cluster diagnostics. By default, diagnostics are enabled on your cluster to assist with troubleshooting issues. Select the Fabric upgrade mode you want to set your cluster to. Select Automatic if you want the system to automatically pick up the latest available version and try to upgrade your cluster to it. Set the mode to Manual if you want to choose a supported version. To make setting up a secure test cluster easy for you, we have provided the basic option. If you already have a certificate and have uploaded it to your Key Vault and enabled the Key Vault for deployment, then use the Custom option. In Basic option, add or reuse an existing Key Vault and add a certificate. The addition of the certificate is a synchronous process, and so you'll have to wait for the certificate to be created. Resist the temptation of navigating away from the screen until the process is completed. This will take a minute. Now that the certificate is added to your Key Vault, you may see this screen prompting you to edit the access policies for your Key Vault. Click on the Edit Access Policies For button. Click on the Advanced Access Policies and enable access to the virtual machine, Resource Manager, and Disk Encryption. Once you've made your selections, do not forget to click the Save button and close out of the Access Policies pane. You are now ready to proceed to the rest of the Create Cluster process. Before you do that, download the certificate. Look inside the large blue informational box for the link. Make sure to keep the certificate in a safe place. You need it to connect to your cluster. Since the certificate you downloaded does not have a password, it is advised that you add one. To complete the cluster creation, click Create. You can optionally download the template. You can see the creation progress in the notifications. Click on the bell icon near the status bar at the upper right of your screen. If you clicked Pin to Start Board while creating the cluster, you see Deploying Service Fabric Cluster pinned to the Start Board. In order to perform management operations on your cluster using PowerShell or CLI, you need to connect to your cluster. Now, if you select Pin to Dashboard in the Deployment Succeeded section, you can see the cluster on the dashboard. Cool, isn't it? You can inspect your cluster in the portal. Go to Browse and click Service Fabric Clusters. Locate your cluster and click it. You can now see the details of your cluster in the dashboard, including the cluster's public endpoint and a link to Service Fabric Explorer. So, that was all about cluster creation. With this, we've reached the end of the section. We've now got introduced to Microsoft Azure and have also seen Azure DevOps Solution. Great! In the next section, we will learn about Docker.